I want to point something out about these theories. Weinrib, Fletcher, and Epstein are all giving us a fairness-based theory. Law and economics is giving us a utility-based theory. Now, I want to say something about how that works, because I think it illustrates some of what's at stake here. Fletcher, Epstein, and Weinrib are looking at the following question. What is the relationship between the defendant, his actions, his behavior, etc., and the harm to the defendant? And they're all arguing that that is what determines whether or not a person should have to pay or should be required to pay under the tort law. The tort law is looking to see if there's the right kind of connection between the plaintiff and the damage to the defendant. And that's what should determine the outcome of a tort law case. They're not asking, would this type of relationship tend to produce good or bad consequences for the public as a whole? They're saying it's the fact that that kind of relationship was there between the defendant and the damage that determines on its own, irrespective of these more general questions about consequences, that determines whether or not the person should be held liable to pay. One place where this comes up clearly is when we look at product liability. As I said, the law and economics model could potentially end up saying that with food, medicine, and cars, we should have a strict liability standard, but with everything else, we should have a negligence standard. Now, at this point, someone could step in and say, whoa, wait a minute. What the food companies and the toy companies were doing was not essentially different. In both cases, they manufactured a product. If neither party was negligent, all they were doing was manufacturing a product that the other party agreed to accept, well, then that should be the end of it. And these economic calculations should not be brought into it. Right? It's unfair that parties who behaved in essentially similar ways, right, should have unequal obligations. Right? Since they behaved in essentially similar ways, there's the same kind of connection between their actions and the damage. Either both should have to pay or neither should have to pay. Right? It shouldn't matter what the consequences of the rules are for the public as a whole. Right? Now, you might say that food is a special thing because you need it to live. Okay, so that could get factored in. But if it turns out the difference is between one type of luxury good and another type of luxury good, or between one type of essential and another type of essential, it doesn't seem that it's fair, at first glance, for one party to have to pay and another party not to have to pay. Whereas the law and economics model might say, well, in one sense that might seem unfair, but what we're interested in here is the system that will produce the most good overall. Right? You might think of it like this. They might say, well, look, okay, they might show evidence. If we went with your fairness standards, then standards of living for everyone in society would be lowered for all these reasons. Right? And it's not right that the whole public should have to pay and should have to lose out on all these good things in order to preserve this sort of pristine supposed standard of fairness between the different types of manufacturers. So again, what we have here is a difference between fairness standards and a utility standard. However, I should also note, even if a person sides with the fairness standards, then they're going to disagree about, or they might disagree about exactly what kind of relationships between the defendant and the damage to the plaintiff, right, give rise to the obligation to pay.